The night of the Ashmore Winter Ball, Sophia stood at the edge of the candlelit gallery and heard her own marriage described as a transaction, delivered in a voice that assumed no one worth informing was listening. She had been wrong about what she could endure. She had believed, when she first came to Ashmore 4 months ago as the Duke of Ashmore's new and unremarkable Duchess, that she understood the full shape of her situation. She had understood the debt, the £4,000 her father's estate had owed and could not repay, and the settlement that had cleared it. She had understood that Stephen Petrov had chosen her because she was manageable, because she would not embarrass him at dinner or demand his attention in the library, because a plain woman from a modest family with clear eyes and no illusions was a wife who would ask nothing inconvenient. She had even understood, in the way one understands a thing one cannot change, the particular words he had used on their wedding night, standing at the window of the Ashmore master bedroom, while the house settled and cooled around them. He had said, without cruelty and without apology, looking at the frost on the glass, rather than at her, "I married you because you were plain. I needed a wife who would not complicate things." She had curtsied, which was the wrong gesture for a wife in her own bedroom, and she had thanked him, which was the wrong response to anything a husband had ever said. And she had gone to her own room and sat on the edge of the bed in her wedding dress until the candle guttered and went out. She had not wept. She had simply decided, with the methodical clarity she applied to all problems she could not solve, that she would be the most capable plain woman Ashmore had ever housed. And she had been. She had learned the housekeeper's accounts and found 2 errors that had been compounding for 6 years. She had organized the library by subject rather than by acquisition date and found 3 volumes that had been missing since Stephen's father's time. She had learned which tenants were struggling before the winter came in hard and arranged, through Agnes the housekeeper, for the distribution of preserved stores from the east cellar that would otherwise have sat until spring. She had done all of this quietly, without requesting notice or permission, because she had understood that a woman who makes herself useful is harder to discard than a woman who makes herself felt. She had been wrong about what she could endure. Standing at the edge of the gallery, holding a glass of ratafia she had not touched, she heard Dorothea, Stephen's mother, say to Cecily Vane in the particular carrying whisper that well-bred women use when they wish to be overheard by a specific person. She was a convenience. Stephen needed to settle an obligation, and she had a face that would cause no one any trouble. That is all there is to it. Cecily, whose gold hair caught every candle in the room and who wore diamonds at her throat that were not borrowed, had murmured something sympathetic. Dorothea had snapped open her fan and added, with a precision that was almost admirable, "The Duke deserves better, and he has always known it. We shall simply allow the arrangement to run its course." Sophia set down her glass on the nearest table. She did not permit herself to look across the room toward Stephen, who stood near the great fireplace speaking with his solicitor, Mr. Gerald Ashford, whose presence she now understood had nothing to do with estate business. She did not permit herself to count the number of faces that had turned, discreetly, to observe her reaction. She curtsied to no one in particular, which was, she thought, entirely accurate. Then she walked through the servants' door at the far end of the gallery, retrieved her heaviest cloak from the hook outside the pantry, where she had quietly left it 2 hours ago, against a chill she had not yet named, and went out into the snow. The mountain lodge was 7 miles from the house. She had been there once in autumn, when the larches were still gold, and the path was clear, riding alone because Stephen had gone to London the same morning, and no one had thought to accompany her. She knew the way. The estate's oldest mare, a grey named November, who was 20 years old and entirely indifferent to weather, stood saddled in the east stable because Sophia had asked the second groom to have her ready at 9 o'clock, telling him only that she might wish to ride. He had not questioned her. Plain, capable women who manage the housekeeper's accounts are rarely questioned about horses. The snow was not heavy yet, only a thin and steady fall that turned the track to silver under a half moon. She rode without hurrying, which was important. A woman who rides desperately in the dark tells everyone something about herself. She was not desperate. She was finished. If this story moves you, please leave a word in the comments and stay close. There is more yet to come. Ashmore had come to her in pieces, the way large things always do. The first piece had been the entryway, which was older than anyone alive, and smelled of beeswax and cold stone, and which had told her, on the morning of her arrival, that it had received many women, and outlasted all of them. The second piece had been Agnes, who had appeared from a side corridor with a ring of keys at her belt and a face that had withheld judgment so thoroughly it constituted its own welcome. Agnes had shown her the house without commentary, which Sophia had recognized as the highest form of respect available in those circumstances, and she had remembered every room. The third piece had been Stephen himself, who was 34 years old, and carried himself with the particular stillness of a man who had decided, some years ago, that the world would not require much from him if he did not offer much in return. He was not an unkind man. That was the specific difficulty. Unkind men are legible. They give you the full shape of what you are dealing with, and you can brace against it. Stephen's coldness was not unkind. It was simply very quiet and very deep, and left no room for anything else. He had met her at the foot of the staircase on the morning after their wedding, and asked whether she had slept well. She had said she had, which was not entirely true, and he had nodded once and gone to his study, and that had established between them the entire architecture of the next 4 months. Dorothea arrived at Ashmore 3 weeks after the wedding and made no secret of her assessment. She had looked at Sophia across the breakfast table on the morning of her arrival and said, to no one in particular, that Stephen had always been sensible about obligations. It was said in the voice one uses to describe a man who has had a difficult tooth extracted, with sympathy for the pain and approval of the decision. Sophia had passed the marmalade and asked about the journey from London. Cecily followed Dorothea by a fortnight, having been invited, ostensibly, to see the estate in its autumn color, and having arrived, demonstrably, as proof of something. She was everything Sophia was not, which was not her fault, and she wore it with the unconscious ease of a woman who has never had occasion to consider the alternative. She asked intelligent questions about the estate at dinner, and looked at Stephen when she asked them, and Stephen answered her with 2 more words than he typically offered Sophia, which Sophia recorded without comment in the ledger she kept of things she understood and could not change. It was at this dinner, with the candles at their second hour, and the pheasant cleared, and Dorothea arranging her rings against the tablecloth, that Sophia heard her own situation spoken aloud for the second time. Dorothea had leaned toward Cecily, who sat at her right, and said in a voice calibrated for the table's width, "The arrangement was a practical one. The girl had a debt, and Stephen had a vacancy. One does not attach sentiment to such arrangements." And then she had looked at Sophia directly, with the composed, assessing gaze of a woman whose categories have always worked, and added, "You understand, of course." Sophia had understood. She had also understood that Dorothea was not wrong, which was worse. What she had not understood in those first weeks was Stephen. She had catalogued his deniable attentions the way she catalogued the housekeeper's accounts, noting each without assigning it too much weight, because a plain woman in a marriage of convenience who mistakes attention for preference is a woman who has miscalculated everything. He had asked once what she was reading, and when she told him it was the estate's drainage survey from 17 years ago, he had stood in the doorway of the library for a moment longer than the question required. He had handed her down from a carriage in the village and not released her elbow before they reached the door of the draper's shop. He had appeared, twice, at the East Garden in the morning, without having mentioned any intention to be there, and on both occasions had walked beside her without speaking for a quarter of an hour, which she had not known how to refuse, and had therefore not refused. She had told herself these were the small civic decencies of a man who had been raised to manage a household and its inhabitants with something resembling courtesy. She had told herself this in the firm, clear voice she used for things she needed to believe. Then had come the afternoon of the kitchen maid. Her name was Polly, and she was 16 years old. And she had been accused by the head cook of taking a silver sugar spoon from the kitchen stores. The spoon had been missing for 4 days, and the cook, Mrs. Fenwick, was a woman who organized the world into those who had done things and those who had not done things. And she had placed Polly, without evidence, into the first category. Agnes had come to Sophia because Agnes came to Sophia with all problems the household could not resolve through its own architecture, and Sophia had gone down to the kitchen and listened to both parties and asked, methodically, where the spoon had last been seen in use. Mrs. Fenwick had said the mantelpiece in the small dining room 4 days ago when the sugar was set out for Mr. Ashford's visit. Sophia had gone to the small dining room and looked at the mantelpiece and found the spoon behind the vase of dried teasels, where it had presumably fallen when the vase was moved for dusting. She had brought it back to the kitchen and set it on the table between Mrs. Fenwick and Polly, and said in a voice that was neither loud nor particularly warm that she expected Polly to receive an apology before supper, and that she expected the matter to be considered resolved, and that if it was not resolved, she would find it necessary to speak with His Grace about the protocols for the household's disciplinary proceedings, which she had noticed had not been formally written down. She had not known Stephen was in the corridor. She had not known he had come through the servants' passage from the east wing, which was the shorter route to the stables, and had been standing 4 feet from the kitchen door since she produced the spoon from behind the teasels. She had not known any of it until later, when Agnes told her, with the careful neutrality that was Agnes's highest form of communication, that His Grace had remained in the corridor for some time after she left, and that he had arrived at the stables considerably after he had intended to. Sophia had filed this information without conclusion, the way she filed all information she did not know what to do with. She was 3 miles from the house now, on the track that climbed through the larch wood toward the high meadow, and the snow was thickening. November picked her way through it with the philosophical calm of an old mare who has been out in worse. The cold was clean and definite. Sophia found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she was not cold. She was composed, which was a different state entirely, and which she recognized, with a kind of dispassionate precision, as the composure of a woman who has made a decision that cannot be unmade. She had not asked to be a convenience. She had agreed to it. There was a difference, and she had lived inside that difference for 4 months with her head up and her accounts in order. And she had told herself the difference was enough. She had been wrong, and the wrongness of it had been announced tonight, in a room full of people whose names she now knew, by a woman whose estimation of her was entirely accurate. She did not blame Dorothea. She had almost said so, in the gallery, before she remembered that she had nothing to say that the room needed to hear. The lodge appeared at the edge of the high meadow as she had remembered it, a low stone building with a slate roof and a single chimney that was, to her minor surprise, not entirely cold. She had not thought about the lodge's state since autumn. She had not thought, when she arranged for November to be saddled, that anyone would have thought to lay a fire. Someone had. The grate held old ash, and 2 fresh birch logs that had been placed, not recently, but at some point in the last weeks by someone who knew the lodge and kept it. She found the tinder in the usual place, inside the iron box to the left of the hearth, and she lit the fire herself, because she had always lit her own fires when she could manage it. Having grown up in a house where the servants were few, and the principle of managing for oneself was an inheritance more reliable than money. She unsaddled November and put her in the small stable lean-to at the back of the lodge, gave her the hay that had been stacked there in autumn, and came back inside. She took off her cloak and hung it on the peg by the door. She sat down in the chair nearest the fire, which was a plain wooden chair with a straight back, and she looked at the flames and did not think about anything in particular, for what felt like the first time in 4 months. She was still sitting there when she heard the horse outside. She had known he would come. She had not known she had known this until the sound of hooves on frozen ground reached her through the lodge's single window, and she recognized, in the steadying of her own breath, that she had been waiting. Not hoping. Waiting, which is a colder and more precise condition. Stephen came through the door without knocking, which was not a rudeness but an urgency, and stopped when he saw her sitting by the fire. He was wearing his riding coat with the collar up, and his dark hair was dusted with snow, and he was breathing with the depth of a man who has ridden 7 miles through early snow in the dark, and is not entirely certain what he will find at the other end. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the fire, which she had lit herself, and at the cloak on the peg, and at November's tack hung on the hook beside the door. Reading a room, she had learned, was something he did with the same thoroughness he applied to everything he chose to pay attention to. He said, "You rode alone." She said, "I did." He said, 7 miles. In the snow?" She said, "The snow was not heavy when I left." He did not sit down. He stood near the door with his hat in his hand and looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face in 4 months, which was the expression of a man who has run out of the particular distance he has been maintaining between himself and something he does not know how to approach. It had been behind his eyes, she understood now, for some time. Since the kitchen, perhaps. Since the drainage survey. Since the morning in the East Garden when he had walked beside her for a quarter of an hour in silence, and she had not asked him to stop. He said, after a pause that held the full weight of 4 months, "My mother had no right to say what she said." She considered this. She said, "She was accurate." He said, "Sophia." It was the first time he had used her given name without the preceding formality of her title, and it landed with the weight of something he had been carrying in his coat pocket and had finally set down. She heard it land. She did not look away. He crossed to the other chair, the one across the hearth from hers, and he sat down heavily, the way a man sits when he has been standing inside a decision for longer than he intended, and has finally reached the chair on the other side of it. He said, "I said something to you on our wedding night." She said, "You did." He said, "I said it because I was afraid of something, and I did not know how to name it. I called it a practical consideration. I called it a requirement of the match." She waited. She had learned in 4 months that Stephen did not speak without having already thought the thing through, and that the first sentence was never the one that contained the difficulty. He looked at the fire for a moment, and then looked at her, and she saw it, the wound she had been reading around the edges of for months, without knowing she was reading it. He said, in a voice stripped of everything but the fact, "I was married before. Her name was Catherine. She left Ashmore 6 years ago and died the following winter, and I have spent the years since telling myself she left because I could not be present to anyone who mattered to me. That I was constitutionally absent. That the correct thing to do with a second marriage was to arrange one where presence was not required. He stopped. He looked at his hands. He said, "I chose you because I believed you would not need what I had proven I could not give. I believed your plainness, as I called it, meant you would ask nothing of me. I said it out loud, because I thought if I named the arrangement clearly, there would be no room for anything to grow in the naming," she said quietly. "And yet—" He looked up. She said, "You came 7 miles through the snow." He held her gaze for a long moment, and she saw him understand, perhaps for the first time, that she had seen him clearly for considerably longer than he had imagined. That the woman who catalogued the drainage survey and found the missing spoon and arranged the winter stores for the struggling tenants had been cataloguing him as well, with the same patient, methodical attention she brought to everything she could not immediately solve. He said, "I did not know how to be seen by someone I valued. That is what I was afraid of. That is what I called plainness." The word sat between them in the firelight. She did not rescue him from it. She let it sit. Then she said, "I am not plain." He said, very quietly, "No, you are not." The fire shifted. A birch log broke and settled and sent a brief, bright scatter of sparks up the chimney, and the lodge was warm, and the snow outside the window was coming down in earnest now, and she understood that they were not leaving tonight. She said, "We will need to return in the morning." He said, "Yes." She said, "Your mother will have said a great deal more by then." He said, "Yes, she will have." A pause. She watched his face, which had the quality of a man who has finally put down a stone he has been carrying for so long he had forgotten he was carrying it. He said, "I intend to address that." She said, "How?" He looked at her steadily. He said, "By making certain that no one present at Ashmore this evening has any remaining confusion about what my wife is." She understood, from the particular precision of this sentence, that he meant exactly what he said. She understood that the precision was not performance, but intention, and that intention, in a man who had spent 6 years ensuring that nothing in his chest was legible to anyone, was its own considerable declaration. She did not say, "I believe you." She said, "Then we should sleep and return in the morning." He said, "Yes." She took the smaller room. He took the chair by the fire. She lay in the dark and listened to the snow on the window and thought, with a careful and newly uncertain clarity, that she had arrived at the lodge intending to be finished and was finding instead that she was not finished at all, only changed in the particular way that a room changes when a fire is lit in it after a long cold absence. She was not finished. She was beginning. They rode back in the early light, the snow thick on the larches and the track made quiet under it. They did not speak much, which was no longer the same silence it had been before. Stephen rode beside her, close enough that when November shied briefly at a branch laden with snow, his hand came out without apparent thought and steadied the mare's bridle. And then he looked at Sophia, and she looked at him. And neither of them said anything. She thought, "This is what it looks like when a man stops being absent." The house came into view at the foot of the track, its windows lit against the gray morning, and at the side entrance, wrapped in a shawl over her black dress, Agnes stood waiting with the composure of a woman who had seen the Duke of Ashmore ride out in the dark, and had drawn her own conclusions, and had told no one else, and had simply waited to see how things resolved. She met them at the stable door, and took November's bridle without comment. She said to Sophia, in a low voice, as Sophia dismounted, "The guests are at breakfast. Her ladyship has not come down." Stephen heard this. He said to Agnes, "Would you send word to Mr. Ashford that I require him in the library at 10 o'clock?" Agnes said, "Yes, Your Grace." He offered his arm to Sophia. She took it. They went into the house. The drawing room adjoined the dining room by a pair of paneled doors that were, at Ashmore, customarily left open during the weeks of a house party, a practice that meant all three principal reception rooms flowed together when occasion required. When Stephen brought Sophia through the main hall and into the morning room at 9:30, the 30 or so guests who had remained overnight turned as one, the way an audience turns when an entrance has been arranged. He had not, as far as Sophia could tell, arranged it. He had simply walked into the room with her on his arm and stopped, and the room had organized itself around the fact of it. Dorothea appeared in the doorway to the dining room at the far end, with Cecily 2 steps behind her. Dorothea's face held its customary command, that settled, almost architectural certainty of a woman who has never had occasion to recalibrate her categories. She looked at Stephen. Then she looked at Sophia. Then she looked at their joined arms. And something in her expression shifted, barely, in the way a wall shifts when the foundation beneath it has moved. She said, in a voice that was still largely composed, "Stephen, you have returned." He said, "I have." She said, "We were concerned. You went out last night and no one could account for you." He said, "I went to bring my wife home." A pause. The room's attention, which had been politely distributed, was no longer distributed. Dorothea said, with the last of her composed precision, "Sophia is well aware, I think, of the nature of her place here. There is no need for drama on her behalf." Stephen said in a voice entirely without heat, "Her place here is Duchess of Ashmore. I would ask that you not describe it in any other terms, in this house or anywhere else." Dorothea's fan was in her hand, and she held it very still. She said nothing, and her silence, Sophia recognized, was not the silence of acceptance, but of a woman recalibrating in a hurry and finding fewer options than she had anticipated. Cecily, 2 steps back, said nothing at all. She looked at Sophia with an expression that was not, precisely, hostile. It was the expression of a woman who has understood, in a single moment, that the script she had been handed and had memorized and had performed with considerable polish was a script for a different story entirely, and that the story currently in progress had a different lead. She had dignity enough not to show the collision. She dropped her gaze, very briefly, in something that was almost an acknowledgement. Mr. Ashford appeared in the doorway from the library corridor, precise and unhurried, his black coat brushed and his leather case under his arm. He looked at Stephen with a solicitor's patience and said, "Your Grace, the settlement terms are as you instructed. Shall I have them laid out?" Stephen said, "At 10, as arranged." "Thank you, Ashford." Ashford inclined his head and withdrew, and the room, which had been holding itself very carefully for the last several minutes, redistributed its attention in the small, audible way of 30 people who have witnessed something and are now deciding how to speak about it. Sophia stood at Stephen's side and felt, under her feet, the particular solidity of a floor she had crossed and recrossed for 4 months, as a woman who did not quite belong on it, and felt it differently now. Not warmer, not softer, simply more fully and irrevocably hers. Dorothea looked at her son for a long moment. Then she looked at Sophia, and in her gaze, there was something Sophia had not expected. A small, reluctant adjustment. The expression of a woman who has applied her categories accurately and completely, and has found them wanting in a specific case, and who is too old and too clear-eyed to pretend otherwise indefinitely. She said to Sophia, in a much quieter voice than she had used the night before, You will find the east sitting room warmer in the afternoons. The west light goes early in winter. It was not an apology. It was the closest Dorothea Petrov had come to one in 20 years, and everyone in the room who knew her understood that. Sophia said, "Thank you." I had noticed the light. The season turned. The guests departed. The house settled back into itself, as it always did after company, with a sigh of old timbers and the resumption of its own particular rhythms. Stephen came to find her that afternoon in the library, where she was placing the last of the misfiled volumes back in their corrected order on the shelf. He stood in the doorway, in the way he had stood in the corridor outside the kitchen, present without announcing himself, watching her with the quality of attention he had apparently been paying her for longer than either of them had named. She said, without turning, "The Linnaean survey was shelved with the estate histories. It has been returned to natural philosophy." He said, "Is everything in its correct place?" She turned and looked at him. She said, "Nearly." He crossed the room. He took the volume from her hands with the deliberate care of a man who has decided to be deliberate, and set it on the shelf himself, and kept her hand when he had finished. His thumb moved across her knuckles once, with a tentativeness that was entirely at odds with the authority of everything else about him. He said, "Nearly is not the same as not yet." She said, "No, it is not." The fire in the library hearth had been built up against the afternoon cold, and the snow was still falling outside the long windows, and Agnes had brought in tea at some point, and left it on the low table without being asked, which was Agnes's way of saying that she had understood this moment was coming for considerably longer than anyone else had admitted. Sophia did not think about the wedding night, or the word he had used, or the 4 months in which she had managed his household and herself and her own quiet wound with the same careful competence she applied to everything that could not be solved immediately. She thought about the 7 miles of snow, and the fire she had lit herself, and the chair he had taken across the hearth from her, and the moment he had said her name. She thought, he came. He had not sent a servant or a note or a reasonable morning-hour message expressing concern for her safety. He had ridden 7 miles in the dark through early snow on an estate he knew as well as his own hands, because the lodge was on his land, and the land was his, and she was, he had finally and irreversibly decided, his in the only way that mattered, which had nothing to do with settlement terms, or the clearing of £4,000 of family debt, and everything to do with the space across the hearth, that only she seemed to fill in a way he could no longer pretend was incidental. Agnes appeared in the library doorway, her ring of keys at her side, and her shawl drawn up against the draught from the hall, and she took in the room with one sweeping housekeeper's glance. The fire, the tea, the two of them standing close together near the shelves with their hands not quite released. She said, with the composure of a woman who has been waiting 4 months for exactly this, "Shall I have supper laid early, Your Grace?" Stephen looked at Sophia. Sophia said, "Yes, please, Agnes, something warm." Agnes made a small sound that was not quite approval and not quite satisfaction, and was, in the particular vocabulary of women who have managed great houses for 30 years, precisely both. She withdrew. The snow came down outside the tall windows, soft and steady, covering the drive and the garden and the track through the larchwood, covering the 7 miles between the house and the mountain lodge where the fire had burned, and the birch logs had settled, and the horses had stood in the lean-to, with the patient, uncomplaining warmth of old animals in cold weather. Somewhere in the house, a piano was being played, tentatively, by someone who was perhaps only now returning to a piece left unfinished. The notes came through the ceiling or the walls, muffled and intermittent, and then settled into something recognizable, a slow air in a minor key that was not sad, but had the quality of a thing that has been through some weather and is still standing. Sophia held Stephen's hand near the library fire and thought of nothing in particular, except that the room was warm, and the snow was falling, and Agnes would come back with supper, and that this specific set of facts arranged in this order in this house, was her life, and it was hers, and she had not been wrong to stay. The snow fell on, the piano played on. Agnes moved somewhere below, with the steadiness of a household in its rightful order. Outside the window, the drive was entirely white, and there were no tracks left in it at all.